You probably don't know how to argue. That sounds insulting. But it's probably true. Look at almost any political debate today. People interrupt each other. They avoid difficult questions. They attack personalities instead of ideas. They appeal to emotion instead of evidence. And when the debate is over, almost nobody has changed their mind. Only their confidence. It's easy to think this is a modern problem. It isn't. More than 2,000 years ago, Aristotle watched public debates in ancient Greece and realized something extraordinary. A society cannot think clearly if its citizens don't know how to argue. Not argue louder. Not argue longer. Argue better. That's why he created the first systematic study of logic. Not to help people win debates, but to separate good reasoning from persuasion, truth from rhetoric. And once you understand the principles Aristotle discovered, you'll start noticing the same mistakes in political speeches, television interviews, social media, and maybe even in your own thinking. Before we talk about Aristotle, we need to answer a surprisingly simple question. What is an argument? Most people have never actually been taught. School teaches us mathematics, history, science, languages, but almost no one is ever taught how to build an argument. That's why so many discussions become emotional. People have opinions, but they don't know how to support them. They have conclusions, but they've forgotten the reasoning that should lead to those conclusions. Aristotle believed that a good argument isn't just a collection of opinions. It's a structure. And like any structure, if the foundation is weak, everything built on top of it eventually collapses. Every argument, no matter how complex, is built from three simple parts. The first is the premise. A premise is simply a statement that we accept as true for the purpose of the argument. The second is the reasoning, sometimes called the inference. This is the logical connection between the premises and the conclusion. It's the bridge that carries us from what we know to what we are trying to prove. Finally, there is the conclusion, the idea that follows if the reasoning is valid. This may sound abstract. So let's use the most famous example in the history of philosophy. Premise 1. All humans are mortal. Premise 2. Socrates is a human. Therefore, conclusion: Socrates is mortal. Notice something important. The conclusion doesn't appear by magic. It doesn't depend on confidence. It doesn't depend on who said it. It follows naturally from the premises. Let's try another one. Premise 1. All birds have feathers. Premise 2. A sparrow is a bird. Therefore, conclusion: a sparrow has feathers. Again, the conclusion follows naturally. Nothing is forced. Now consider something more practical. Premise 1. If it rains, the streets become wet. Premise 2. It is raining. Therefore, conclusion: the streets will become wet. Simple. Logical. Predictable. This is how good reasoning works. Now let's compare that with something people often call an argument, but actually isn't. Imagine someone says, "I know this is true because I just feel it." That isn't an argument. It's a feeling. Feelings can be valuable. They can even point us toward important questions. But by themselves, they don't establish a conclusion. Or imagine someone says, "Everyone knows that's true." Again, that isn't an argument. It's an appeal to popularity. How many people believe something tells us nothing about whether it's actually true. For centuries, millions of people believed the Earth stood still. They were wrong. Here's another example. I've believed this my entire life. That's not an argument either. It's simply a description of how long you've held a belief. The age of an opinion doesn't make it more reliable. Now consider this statement. He's wrong because he's an idiot. Is that an argument? No. It's an insult. Whether someone is intelligent or not has no bearing on whether their reasoning is correct. We'll come back to mistakes like this later in the video. For now, notice how often people mistake confidence, emotion, or certainty for reasoning. Aristotle wanted us to slow down, to ask a simple question every time we hear a claim. What are the premises? How does this conclusion follow? If those questions cannot be answered, there's a good chance you haven't been given an argument at all. Now let's look at another example. Someone says, all philosophers are intelligent. Socrates is intelligent. Therefore, Socrates is a philosopher. At first, it sounds reasonable. But it isn't. Because intelligence alone doesn't make someone a philosopher. The conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from the premises. Now imagine another example. Premise 1. Every doctor studied medicine. Premise 2. Sarah studied medicine. Therefore, Sarah is a doctor. Again, the reasoning fails. Studying medicine may be necessary to become a doctor, but it isn't sufficient. Sarah could be a researcher, a professor, or a medical student. The conclusion goes beyond what the premises actually justify. This is what Aristotle called a bad argument. Not because the conclusion is false. It might even be true. Sarah could, in fact, be a doctor. But the reasoning doesn't prove it. And that's the key insight. A true conclusion can still come from a bad argument. Likewise, a false conclusion can sometimes result from perfectly valid reasoning. If one of the premises is false, Aristotle cared about both true premises and valid reasoning, because only when both are present can we trust the conclusion. And here's the fascinating part. Most bad arguments don't fail because the conclusion is wrong. They fail because the path leading to that conclusion is broken. Once you begin paying attention to the reasoning instead of the confidence of the speaker, you'll start seeing these mistakes everywhere. In political debates, television interviews, advertisements, social media, and sometimes even in your own thinking. Because Aristotle's greatest lesson wasn't how to defeat other people. It was how to avoid deceiving yourself. Now that you know what a good argument looks like, we can finally ask another important question. Why do so many arguments fail? Aristotle understood something that is still true today. Most people don't arrive at the wrong conclusion because they're unintelligent. They arrive there because somewhere along the way, their reasoning breaks down. Sometimes it's accidental. Sometimes it's deliberate. And sometimes it's so common that we don't even notice it anymore. These mistakes are known as logical fallacies. They don't necessarily make a conclusion false, but they do make the argument weaker. Much weaker. Once you learn to recognize them, you'll begin hearing them everywhere. Let's look at some of the most common ones. 1. Ad hominem. Imagine someone says, I believe this economic policy will reduce inflation. Instead of responding to the argument, someone replies, why should we listen to you? You've been wrong before. Or, you're too young to understand economics. Or, "You're just saying that because you're rich." Notice what happened. The original argument was never answered. Instead, the attention shifted to the person making it. This is called an ad hominem attack. Instead of evaluating the reasoning, you attack the speaker. Sometimes, the criticism might even be true. The person could be inexperienced. They could have made mistakes in the past. None of that tells us whether the argument itself is correct. Aristotle insisted that ideas should stand or fall on their own reasoning, not on who speaks them. 2. Straw man. This one is incredibly common. Imagine someone says, "I think students should spend less time on standardized testing and more time developing critical thinking skills." Another person responds, "So you don't think students should take any exams at all?" That isn't what was said. The original argument has been replaced with an exaggerated version that's much easier to attack. Like building a straw man instead of fighting a real opponent. It's easier to knock down, but you've defeated something the other person never actually argued. Good thinkers respond to what was really said, not to the weaker version they wish had been said. 3. Appeal to popularity. Have you ever heard someone say, "Millions of people believe this," or "Everyone knows that's true," as if popularity itself were evidence? History teaches us otherwise. For centuries, almost everyone believed the sun revolved around the earth. Popularity didn't make that belief correct. Truth isn't decided by a vote. A claim can be believed by millions and still be false. 4. Appeal to authority. This fallacy is a little more subtle. Imagine someone says, "This diet must work. A famous actor recommends it." Or, "A billionaire said this investment is guaranteed." Experts matter. Experience matters. But authority alone is never enough. The real question remains, what is the evidence? A Nobel Prize-winning physicist can still be mistaken about nutrition. A world-famous athlete can misunderstand economics. Credentials deserve respect, not blind obedience. 5. False dilemma. Sometimes people present only two options, when many more actually exist. You either support this proposal, or you don't care about education. You either agree with me, or you're against freedom. Reality is rarely that simple. Most important issues contain nuance. Good reasoning explores complexity. Bad reasoning forces unnecessary choices. 6. Circular reasoning. This one often hides in plain sight. Imagine someone says, "Why is this book trustworthy?" "Because everything in it is true." "How do you know everything in it is true?" "Because it's a trustworthy book." Nothing has actually been explained. The conclusion simply repeats the premise. The reasoning moves in a circle, instead of moving forward. 7. Appeal to emotion. Emotion is an essential part of being human. But emotion isn't evidence. Imagine someone says, "If you really cared about your family, you would agree with me." Or, "If this story doesn't make you angry, there's something wrong with you." Strong emotions can inspire action, but they don't prove that a conclusion is correct. An argument should be accepted because it is well supported, not because it makes us afraid, or guilty, or inspired. Notice something fascinating. None of these mistakes require low intelligence. In fact, highly intelligent people commit these fallacies every day. Politicians, journalists, professors, business leaders, scientists, friends, family members. even philosophers. And if we're honest, so do we. The purpose of learning logic isn't to become better at spotting other people's mistakes. It's to become better at recognizing our own. Because Aristotle believed that the greatest victory in an argument isn't defeating another person. It's freeing yourself from bad reasoning. If logical fallacies show us how reasoning can go wrong, then Aristotle's laws of logic show us how reasoning stays on track. More than 2,000 years ago, Aristotle laid the foundations of what would become formal logic. His ideas would influence philosophy, science, mathematics, law, and nearly every field that depends on careful reasoning. Surprisingly, the foundation of all of it rests on just a few simple principles. The first is called the law of identity. It sounds complicated, but the idea couldn't be simpler. A thing is what it is. A tree is a tree. A triangle is a triangle. Justice is justice. Before we can discuss something, we first need to know what we're talking about. That may seem obvious, but think about how many arguments begin without anyone agreeing on the meaning of the words. Imagine two people debating whether success is important. One defines success as becoming wealthy. The other defines success as living a meaningful life. They may argue for an hour without realizing they're discussing two completely different ideas. Aristotle would have stopped the conversation almost immediately. Not to choose a side, but to ask a simple question. What do you mean by success? Without clear definitions, reasoning quickly becomes confusion. The second principle is perhaps Aristotle's most famous: the law of non-contradiction. Simply stated, something cannot be true and false at the same time. In the same respect, imagine someone says, "This door is completely open," and in the very same moment, the same door is completely closed. Both statements cannot be true simultaneously. At least not if we're talking about the same door. Under the same conditions. This principle may sound obvious. Yet contradictions appear in conversations more often than we notice. Sometimes a person argues that rules should always be followed, until a particular rule becomes inconvenient. Someone else insists that everyone deserves freedom of expression, except people they disagree with. Or a person claims that facts are unimportant, then immediately uses facts to defend that very claim. Aristotle believed that contradictions are warning signs. When our beliefs contradict each other, at least one of them deserves closer examination. Consistency doesn't guarantee truth, but inconsistency almost always reveals a problem. The third principle is called the law of the excluded middle. Its name sounds intimidating. Its meaning is straightforward. A statement is either true or false in the same context. For example, either it is raining outside, or it isn't. There is no third possibility between those two statements. This law reminds us that clear questions deserve clear answers. Of course, real life is often more complicated. Some questions depend on probability. Others depend on incomplete information. And many situations involve uncertainty. Aristotle understood complexity. These laws were never meant to eliminate nuance. They exist to keep our reasoning coherent, to make sure our conclusions actually follow from what we claim to believe. Taken together, these three principles form the foundation of logical thinking. Know exactly what you're talking about. Avoid contradictions. And follow your reasoning wherever it leads. Simple? Yes. Easy? Not at all. Because the greatest challenge in logic is rarely understanding these principles. The greatest challenge is applying them, especially when emotions become involved. When we're calm, logic feels obvious. When we're angry, proud, or deeply attached to an opinion, logic suddenly becomes much more difficult. Perhaps that's why Aristotle believed that learning logic wasn't merely an intellectual exercise. It was also an exercise in humility, because every logical mistake begins with the same silent assumption: I couldn't possibly be wrong. The moment we become willing to question that assumption, we begin thinking more clearly, and perhaps a little more wisely. So far, we've learned what an argument is. We've learned how bad arguments fail. And we've seen the principles that keep reasoning consistent. But if Aristotle were alive today, how would he actually build an argument? I think he would follow something like 5 simple steps. Not because they guarantee you're right, but because they dramatically increase your chances of reaching the truth. Step 1. Define your terms. This sounds almost too simple. But Aristotle knew most arguments begin with people using the same word to mean completely different things. Imagine 2 people debating whether freedom is the most important value in society. One person defines freedom as the ability to do whatever you want. The other defines it as the ability to live without oppression. They may argue for an hour, without realizing they aren't even discussing the same idea. Before defending your position, ask yourself, what exactly do I mean? Clear thinking begins with clear definitions. Step 2. Separate facts from opinions. This is one of the hardest habits to develop. We all have opinions. There's nothing wrong with that. But an opinion isn't evidence. Imagine someone says, I think this economic policy will fail. That's an opinion. Now imagine they continue. Because countries that adopted similar policies experienced lower economic growth over the following decade. Now we're entering the realm of evidence. Aristotle would encourage us to ask a simple question. What facts support this conclusion? The stronger the evidence, the stronger the argument. Step 3. Make sure your conclusion actually follows from your premises. This may be Aristotle's greatest lesson. Many people collect facts, then jump to conclusions those facts never actually support. Imagine someone says, my grandfather smoked every day, and he lived to be 90. Therefore, smoking isn't dangerous. The story may be true, but the conclusion doesn't follow. One example cannot overturn decades of scientific evidence. Always ask yourself, have I actually proven my conclusion? Or have I simply assumed it? Step 4. Actively look for objections. Most people only search for evidence that confirms what they already believe. Aristotle would probably do the opposite. He would ask, what is the strongest argument against my position? Not the weakest. The strongest. Because if your argument survives serious criticism, it becomes stronger. If it doesn't, you've learned something valuable. Either way, you win. Not because you defeated another person, but because you've moved closer to the truth. Step 5. Be willing to change your mind. Perhaps this is the hardest step of all. Our beliefs become part of our identity. Changing our mind can feel like losing. Aristotle saw it differently. If new evidence appears, and your position changes, you haven't failed. You've improved. Imagine believing something for 10 years, then discovering convincing evidence that you were mistaken. There are 2 possible responses. You can ignore the evidence to protect your pride, or you can accept it and become a wiser person than you were yesterday. Only one of those responses is philosophical. The other is simply stubbornness. Think about these 5 steps together. Define your terms. Support your claims with evidence. Make sure your reasoning is valid. Challenge your own conclusions. And remain willing to change your mind. None of these habits will make you unbeatable in an argument. In fact, they may cause you to lose more debates. Because sometimes, the truth is on the other person's side. And Aristotle would probably say, that's perfectly fine. The purpose of logic was never to help you defeat people. It was to prevent you from defeating yourself. Because every time pride wins over reason, the argument is already lost, long before anyone speaks the final word. So, how would Aristotle argue today? Probably not by speaking louder. Not by interrupting. Not by humiliating the person sitting across from him. He would begin with definitions. He would ask for evidence. He would examine the reasoning. He would question his own conclusions. And if the evidence demanded it, he wouldn't be afraid to change his mind. Because for Aristotle, the purpose of an argument was never victory. It was understanding. In a world where everyone is trying to be heard, perhaps the rarest skill is learning how to think. And maybe that's where every good argument truly begins. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. On this channel, we explore the timeless ideas of history's greatest philosophers. Not just to understand the past, but to think more clearly about the present. I'll see you in the next one.